Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
"Give me the keys," Richard Thompson snapped, his palm hovering impatiently over the white linen tablecloth. "You don't look like you belong in a car like that anyway." The demand cut through the low hum of Asterisk, the Gilded Anchor Asterisk, a restaurant where the scent of truffle oil and aged oak was as thick as the arrogance of its clientele. At the surrounding tables, men in tailored navy suits and women draped in silk paused their conversations, their eyes darting toward the source of the friction. Richard didn't care. He sat at the head of the table, his heavy gold watch catching the light of the crystal chandelier as he gestured toward Annabelle Rose Thompson. Annabelle sat across from him, her fingers tightening around the stem of her water glass. The cold condensation seeped into her skin, a sharp contrast to the heat rising in her chest. She was dressed in a simple, hand-knit cardigan that had seen better days, a stark outlier among the designer labels surrounding her. "The car was a gift from Grandma Alina, Richard," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "She gave it to me so I could get to the music academy. You know how much that job means to me." Richard let out a sharp, mocking laugh that made the waiter nearby flinch. "The music academy? You mean that dilapidated building where you teach nursery rhymes to toddlers for pennies? Don't be ridiculous, Annabelle. That car is a vintage Mercedes. It's a status symbol, an asset. It belongs in a showroom or under the hands of someone who actually contributes to the family's reputation, not parked at a curb in the low-rent district." "He's right, dear," Diane Thompson added, smoothing her perfectly coiffed hair. She didn't look at her daughter. Instead, she adjusted her diamond-encrusted brooch in the reflection of a silver spoon. "It's about the family image. Richard is closing a massive merger this week. He needs to arrive in something that commands respect. You're just being selfish. It's quite embarrassing, really." Megan Thompson, sitting beside Richard, smirked as she scrolled through her phone. "Honestly, Annabelle, look at yourself. You've got flour on your sleeve and your shoes are scuffed. If you drive that car into the city, people will think you stole it. Just give him the keys and take the bus. It's more your speed." The injustice of it felt like a physical weight in the air. Annabelle looked at her family, the people who had spent the last 5 years treating her like a glorified servant while they lived off the dwindling remains of the Thompson estate. They didn't know that the estate was already empty, a hollow shell propped up by Richard's lies and Diane's credit cards. And they certainly didn't know about the secret meetings Annabelle had been attending at the hospice bedside of Alina Whitmore. Annabelle's phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down. A message from Harold Jennings appeared on the screen. "The final signatures are verified. The transition is complete. It's all yours, Annabelle, every cent, every brick." She felt a flicker of something cold and powerful ignite in her gut. She looked up, catching Richard's eye. He looked so certain, so entitled, sitting there in a suit he hadn't yet paid for, boasting about a merger that was built on a foundation of sand. "You think I don't belong in that car, Richard?" Annabelle asked, her voice dropping an octave. "I know you don't," he sneered, leaning forward until she could smell the expensive oud wood cologne he favored. "You're a utility, Annabelle. You're the one who checks on the house and manages the staff when we're traveling. You're not a player. Now the keys, I won't ask again." Annabelle reached into her modest purse. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, embossed envelope, the legal documents Harold had delivered that morning before finding the leather key fob. She pulled it out, the silver emblem glinting under the restaurant lights. The table went silent. Megan stopped scrolling. Diane leaned in, a predatory glint in her eyes. Richard's smirk widened into a look of pure, greedy triumph. "Wise choice," Richard said, reaching out to snatch them. Annabelle didn't hand them over immediately. She held them just out of his reach, her gaze sweeping over the three of them. She saw the greed in Richard, the vanity in Diane, and the vapid cruelty in Megan. For years, she had played the role of the quiet, dutiful daughter, the one who didn't mind the hand-me-downs or the dismissive comments. She had been the sleeping lion, waiting for the right moment to wake. "Take them," Annabelle said, her voice like ice. If you think a car is what defines your status, Richard, then by all means take it. She dropped the keys into his palm. He snatched them up, the metal clinking against his gold rings. Finally, he muttered, pocketing them without a word of thanks. Now, waiter, another bottle of the 1996 vintage. We're celebrating. Actually, Annabelle said, standing up and smoothing her thrifted cardigan, I'm leaving. I have a meeting with Aunt Margaret and Harold Jennings. There are some family matters that need my attention. Richard didn't even look up as the waiter approached. Whatever. Just make sure the gardener knows I'm taking the Mercedes out tomorrow. I want it buffed. Annabelle walked away from the table, her heart thudding a steady, rhythmic beat of anticipation. She didn't look back at the three people who thought they had just won. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, she pulled her phone out and dialed a number. Harold, she said as the call connected. It's time. Richard has the car. He's feeling very confident. Let's make sure he enjoys that feeling for the next 48 hours. It's the last time he'll ever feel it. She looked across the street toward the hospice center where Alina Whitmore lay waiting. The plan was in motion. The trap was set, and the Thompsons had no idea that the girl they had just humiliated was now the woman who owned the roof over their heads. Annabelle turned the corner, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. The countdown had begun. 2 days until the reading of the will. 2 days until the world they had built on her back came crashing down. The next morning, the Thompson estate smelled of imported Kona coffee and unearned confidence. Annabelle Rose Thompson stood in the foyer, her sensible flats silent on the polished marble that she knew, down to the last square inch, was overdue for a resealing. She hadn't slept much, but the adrenaline humming through her veins provided more clarity than caffeine ever could. She had come to collect the last of her sheet music from the conservatory, a room Richard had already begun reclaiming as his own. He was standing in the kitchen, the sharp, metallic click of his designer watch echoing against the granite island as he adjusted his cuffs. When he saw her, his lip curled into the familiar, practiced sneer of a man who mistook cruelty for charisma. He didn't offer her a seat. Instead, he tossed a set of keys onto the counter, the sound jarring in the quiet house. The car is in the shop, Annabelle, Richard said, his voice dripping with casual disdain. I decided the interior wasn't quite up to my standards. I'm having the leather replaced and the engine tuned. It's a shame, really. You clearly didn't know how to maintain such a fine machine. Annabelle didn't flinch. She watched him, noting the way he puffed out his chest, a peacock in a 3-piece suit. I maintained it perfectly for 3 years, Richard. It never gave me a day of trouble. Well, it's in better hands now, he dismissed her with a wave. In fact, don't bother coming back for your things after today. Megan Thompson is moving her fitness equipment into the conservatory this afternoon. Your old piano music and those dusty textbooks. I had the gardener pile them by the curb. If the rain doesn't get them, the garbage truck will. The rage spiked in her chest, hot and sharp, but she forced her hands to remain steady at her sides. She could almost taste the bitterness of the burnt espresso lingering in the air. This was the second time in 12 hours he had reached out to crush something she loved, simply because he could. Behind him, Megan stepped into the room, clad in designer leggings that cost more than Annabelle's monthly grocery budget. Oh, is she still here? Megan asked, not even looking at her sister as she scrolled through her phone. Richard, tell her she can't use the front driveway anymore. It's for guests. She can walk up from the service gate like the help. You heard her, Richard chuckled, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. The service gate suits you better anyway. It matches your aesthetic. Annabelle felt the weight of the heavy brass key hidden in her coat pocket, the master key to the entire estate, given to her by Alina Whitmore 3 months ago. She thought of the digital file currently sitting on a secure server, a document Harold Jennings had finalized just yesterday. It wasn't just a will. It was a deed of absolute ownership. The very floor Richard was standing on didn't belong to him. The coffee he was drinking was paid for by a trust fund he had already exhausted. He was a ghost haunting a house that had already moved on. I'll be sure to remember that, Annabelle said, her voice a low, calm contrast to their sharp barbs. I'll take the service gate, for now. She turned and walked out, leaving their laughter behind. 10 minutes later, she was sitting in a nondescript sedan parked 3 blocks away. Harold Jennings sat in the driver's seat, his expression as grim as a funeral director's. He handed her a thick manila envelope. "The audit is complete," Harold said, his voice hushed. "Richard has been skimming from the estate's maintenance fund for 18 months to cover his gambling debts. He thinks he's the king of the castle, but he's actually about $4 million in the red. If he tries to sell that car, the title won't clear. It's already been flagged as part of the primary estate assets." Annabelle ran her fingers over the embossed seal on the envelope. The texture was slightly rough, a tactile reminder of the power she now held. "And the house. The Thompson name is on the gate, but your name is on the land," Harold confirmed. "In 48 hours, at the reading of the will, the grace period ends. I've already drafted the eviction notices. We just need your signature to execute them the moment the clock strikes noon." Annabelle looked back toward the mansion, a sprawling monument to the arrogance of people who thought blood gave them the right to be monsters. She thought of the books Richard had thrown to the curb and the piano he had treated like a piece of unwanted furniture. "Keep the papers ready, Harold," she said, her gaze hardening. "Richard wants to treat me like the help. Then I think it's only fair he learns what it's like to be homeless." She checked her phone. The countdown was no longer in days, but in heartbeats. Tomorrow was the final gala Aliner had insisted on, the last public appearance of the poor music teacher before the lion woke up. 36 hours, Annabelle whispered. "Let them enjoy their last night in my beds. It's going to be a very long walk to the service gate on Monday morning." The following morning, the sun bled through the heavy velvet curtains of Harold Jennings's private study, casting long, amber stripes across the mahogany desk. Annabelle Rose Thompson sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, watching the dust motes dance in the light. The room smelled of aged leather, floor wax, and the sharp, metallic scent of fresh fountain pen ink. Harold slid a thick, cream-colored folder across the polished wood. His expression was uncharacteristically grim, his usual professional mask replaced by a look of quiet, simmering triumph. "It is finalized, Annabelle. Every account, every shell company Richard thought he'd hidden, and the original deed to the estate. The forensic audit confirms what we suspected. He's been siphoning funds from the charity accounts for years to cover his personal debts." She touched the cool surface of the folder. A jolt of cold electricity seemed to pulse through her fingertips. Inside these pages was the weapon Aliner Whitmore had spent her final months forging. "And the banks. The freeze on the secondary lines of credit is scheduled for midnight," Harold replied, leaning back in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight. "Richard believes he is using the Thompson family legacy to fund tonight's gala. He has no idea that by the time the first bottle of champagne is uncorked, his personal cards will be nothing more than plastic scraps." 18 hours, she whispered, the words tasting like iron. "He thinks tonight is his coronation." "Let him," Harold said. "The higher he climbs, the more spectacular the fall." When she returned to the Thompson estate 2 hours later, the house was a hive of frantic, expensive activity. The scent of lilies was overwhelming, thick enough to clog the throat, mingling with the chemical tang of industrial steamers. Caterers in crisp white uniforms scurried through the foyer, carrying silver platters that caught the morning light. Richard Thompson stood at the center of the chaos, the undisputed master of a kingdom he didn't own. He was shouting at a florist, his face flushed a deep, arrogant red. He looked up as Annabelle entered, his eyes narrowing with immediate, practiced contempt. "There she is," Richard said, loud enough for the staff to pause. "The charity case returns from her morning stroll. I hope you enjoyed the fresh air, Annabelle. It's the last bit of freedom you'll have before you start looking for a job that actually pays a living wage." He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the marble floor. He stopped just inches away, invading her personal space with the casual entitlement of a man who had never been told no. He reeked of expensive scotch and a confidence built on a foundation of sand. "I've already contacted the locksmiths," he sneered, leaning down so only she could hear him. "The moment the last guest leaves tonight, your things will be on the curb. I'm turning your room into a humidor. It's the only way to get the smell of poverty out of the woodwork." He reached out, his hand moving with a slow, insulting deliberateness. He flicked a stray piece of lint off her shoulder, a gesture of pure, condescending dismissal that made the breath hitch in the throats of the watching staff. "You're very certain of the locks, Richard," she said. Her voice was a calm, flat line, devoid of the hurt he clearly expected. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "I'm the one with the name on the deed. You're just the girl Alina felt sorry for. Don't forget that when you're packing your cheap suitcases. Actually, don't bother. Most of what you own belongs in the trash anyway." Megan Thompson appeared at the top of the stairs, draped in a silk robe that shimmered like oil on water. She held a pair of designer stilettos by the straps, dangling them over the banister. "Oh, good, you're back. My regular girl called in sick. These need a buff before the gala. Make yourself useful for once, will you?" She let go of the shoes. They fell, hitting the marble with a heavy, echoing thud at Annabelle's feet. One of the heels scuffed the stone. "I am a music teacher, Megan, not your servant," Annabelle said. Her pulse was a steady, rhythmic drumbeat in her ears. "You're whatever we tell you to be as long as you're eating our food and sleeping under our roof," Megan snapped, her voice sharpening. She looked down at Richard. "Tell her, Rick. Tell her how lucky she is we haven't called the police for trespassing yet." Richard adjusted his gold watch, the sunlight glinting off the face. "She knows. She's just clinging to the last few hours of relevance. It's pathetic, really. Go on, Annabelle. Take the shoes. It'll be good practice for your future career in service." Annabelle didn't look at the shoes. She looked directly at Richard, her gaze as cold and unwavering as a winter sea. She felt the weight of the folder in her bag, the secret power of it humming against her hip. She walked past them, her own heels clicking a sharp, defiant staccato that seemed to cut through Richard's laughter. She retreated to her room, the small, drafty space at the end of the hall that they had relegated her to after Alina's health began to fail. She locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling the leather folder from her bag. She flipped to the final page, her eyes landing on the section Harold had highlighted in red. She didn't need to read the legal jargon. Her mind was fixed on the 7 words at the bottom that changed the world. Sole and absolute owner of all assets. She picked up her phone and dialed Harold's private line. "The gala starts at 7, she said when he answered. "James Harrison and Aunt Margaret will be in the front row. I want the presentation synced to the house's main projector. I don't want him to just hear the truth, Harold. I want him to watch his life dissolve in high definition." "The files are already uploaded to the house server," Harold replied, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. "The moment you give the signal, the Thompson legacy presentation will be replaced by the audit results and the deed. It's a masterpiece of timing, Annabelle." "Good," she said, her eyes catching her reflection in the vanity mirror. The quiet, mousy music teacher was gone. In her place was a woman with a steady hand and a heart of flint. She stood and walked to the closet, pulling out a garment bag she had hidden behind her old coats. She unzipped it to reveal a black silk dress, the fabric so dark it seemed to swallow the light. It wasn't the modest, blending-in outfit her family expected. It was a gown of war. Tonight the music wouldn't be a lullaby, it would be a reckoning. She looked at the clock. 6 hours. 6 hours until the lion finally stopped pretending to sleep. She ran a hand over the silk, feeling the smooth, cold texture. "Enjoy your last sunset, Richard," she whispered to the empty room. "It's going to be a very dark night." The morning of the Thompson Legacy Gala arrived with a suffocating layer of humidity that seemed to cling to the marble floors of the estate. Annabelle Rose Thompson stood on the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold mahogany railing. Below, the foyer was a battlefield of floral arrangements and white-gloved staff. Richard Thompson marched through the center of the chaos, his voice booming over the clatter of crystal. He was barking orders at James Harrison, the event coordinator, about the placement of the legacy banner. It was a massive, gilded eyesore that listed the family's acquisitions over the last decade: assets Annabelle knew were built on a foundation of sand. "It needs to be higher, James," Richard snapped, his face flushed with self-importance. "This isn't just a party, it's a statement of my dominance in this market. I want people to see that name the second they walk in." Richard looked up, spotting her. His lip curled in that familiar way, a mixture of boredom and irritation. "Annabelle, why are you just standing there like a statue? Go help Megan with the seating charts. And for heaven's sake, change out of that cardigan. You look like a librarian at a funeral." "I'm just admiring the foundation, Richard," she replied, her voice remarkably steady. "It's amazing how much weight a single name can carry. I hope it's strong enough for tonight." Richard let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "The foundation is solid gold, little sister. Something you wouldn't understand, seeing as you've spent your life playing piano for toddlers. Just stay out of the shot when the photographers arrive. We don't need the charity case, ruining the family portrait." She turned away before the sting of his words could register. In her pocket, the encrypted flash drive Harold had prepared felt like a hot coal against her thigh. She retreated to the library, where the scent of old paper and beeswax offered a temporary sanctuary. Harold Jennings was waiting by the window, his silver hair catching the morning light. He didn't turn around as she entered, but the tension in his shoulders was evident. "The audit is finalized," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the caterers. "Richard's personal accounts are a spiderweb of redirected company funds. He's been borrowing against assets that don't belong to him for years. He's leveraged the estate, the firm, even Grandma's trust." "And the deed?" she asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Safe, registered, irrefutable." Harold finally turned, his eyes searching hers. "Once that presentation starts, there's no going back, Annabelle. You'll be stripping the roof off this house while they're all inside it." "They took the walls long ago," she said. "I'm just reclaiming the ground." The door swung open, and Diane Thompson entered the library, her heels clicking sharply on the parquet. She smelled of Chanel No. 5 and nervous ambition. She ignored Harold entirely, her eyes fixed on her daughter with a cold, clinical gaze. "Annabelle, Richard is right. You're being incredibly morose today," Diane said, adjusting a stray hair on her daughter's shoulder with a touch that felt more like a pinch. "This is a big night for your brother. His reputation is what keeps this family afloat. Don't you dare do anything to embarrass us with your moods." "I wouldn't dream of it, Mother," Annabelle said. "I want tonight to be exactly what Richard deserves, every bit of it." Diane sighed, a dramatic, weary sound. "I don't know why you've become so difficult, after everything we've provided. Just try to smile. It's the least you can do for the Thompson name." Aunt Margaret was sitting in the corner, ostensibly knitting, but her sharp eyes were darting between Diane and her niece. She was the only one who remembered the girl who used to play until her fingers bled, only to have the instrument sold out from under her to cover Richard's first failed venture. She caught Annabelle's gaze and gave a single, imperceptible nod. "The music will be quite different tonight, won't it, dear?" Margaret asked, her voice crackling like dry leaves. "Much louder, Auntie," Annabelle promised. Richard re-entered the room, checking his gold Rolex with a flourish. "Enough chatter. The caterers need the library for the VIP bar. Annabelle, move, now." He didn't even wait for her to stand before he started moving chairs. He was so convinced of his own gravity that he didn't notice the way Harold Jennings watched him, not with the usual professional deference, but with the clinical detachment of an undertaker measuring a body. Richard stopped, his hand on the back of the heavy oak chair that had been their father's. "You look different today, Annabelle. Smugger, did you finally get a promotion at that little school of yours?" "Something like that," she said, standing tall. "I've just realized that some things are worth more than they appear on the surface." "Cryptic nonsense," Richard scoffed, turning his back to her. "Typical, just make sure you're ready by 7, and try to look like you belong in this house, even if we both know you're just a guest." Annabelle walked toward the door, stopping only when she reached the threshold. She didn't look back. "I'll be ready, Richard. I hope you are too. It's a long way down from a borrowed pedestal." He didn't even bother to respond, his laugh following her down the hall like a taunt. He had no idea the countdown had already hit 0. The evening arrived with a suffocating sense of grandeur. The Thompson estate transformed into a glittering monument to Richard's vanity. By 7 o'clock, the long gravel driveway was choked with luxury sedans, their headlights cutting through the rising mist like predatory eyes. Inside, the air was thick with the cloying scent of forced gardenias and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. It was a celebration of the Thompson legacy, a gala Richard had organized to solidify his standing before the upcoming merger, and he had spared no expense with money that wasn't his. Annabelle Rose Thompson stood at the edge of the grand foyer, her hand resting lightly on the banister. She had chosen a dress of deep navy silk, elegant, understated, and far too refined for the charity case role Richard had scripted for her. She felt the weight of the small, silver flash drive tucked into her clutch, a cold piece of metal that felt heavier than lead. It was the key to everything. "There she is!" a voice boomed, dripping with a condescension that made the hair on Annabelle's neck stand up. Richard Thompson approached, flanked by James Harrison, the city's most influential venture capitalist. Richard looked every bit the master of the manor in a bespoke tuxedo that probably cost more than Annabelle's annual salary at the conservatory. He didn't look at his sister with affection. He looked at her like a smudge on a polished lens. "James, I don't believe you've met my sister, Annabelle," Richard said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "She's the family's resident martyr, spends her days teaching scales to underprivileged children. It's a sweet little hobby, really, though I keep telling her that passion doesn't pay the property taxes." James Harrison offered a polite, somewhat strained smile. "Music is a noble pursuit, Ms. Thompson." "It's more than a pursuit, Mr. Harrison," Annabelle replied, her voice calm and level. "It's about harmony, knowing when a single discordant note is about to ruin the entire symphony." Richard let out a sharp, barking laugh and clapped a hand on James's shoulder. "See, cryptic, she's been like this all day. I think the humidity is getting to her. Annabelle, dear, why don't you run along and find Megan? She was complaining that the catering staff was moving too slowly. Perhaps you could give them a hand. You've always had a knack for service." The insult was calculated, delivered with a casual cruelty that caused a few nearby guests to pause, their wine glasses hovering midair. Annabelle didn't flinch. She watched the way Richard adjusted his cufflinks, gold, embossed with the family crest he hadn't earned, and felt a flicker of something cold and sharp ignite in her chest. "I'll find Megan," Annabelle said softly, "but I think you'll find the staff is doing exactly what they've been instructed to do." She moved away before he could retort, weaving through the crowd of socialites and power brokers. The sound of high heels on the marble floor echoed like a countdown. Every corner of this house whispered of Eleanor Whitmore's meticulous care, yet Richard had plastered over her history with his own brand of gaudy arrogance. In the dining hall, the long mahogany table was set for 40. Megan Thompson was there, draped in a gown of shimmering gold sequins that looked like armor. She was berating a young server because the vintage of the Chardonnay wasn't chilled to her exact, arbitrary preference. "It's a simple task," Megan snapped, her voice carrying over the soft strains of the string quartet. "If I wanted incompetence, I'd have hired from Annabelle's neighborhood." She looked up as Annabelle approached, her lip curling in a practiced sneer. "Oh, look, the guest of honor has arrived. Or are you here to ask for a loan? Richard mentioned you were looking smug earlier. I assumed you finally found a way to pay off your student debts." "I'm just here to enjoy the show, Megan," Annabelle said, her eyes scanning the room. She spotted Aunt Margaret near the French doors, looking uncomfortable in a stiff brocade dress. Margaret was the only one who had visited Eleanor in the hospice without an ulterior motive. She was also the only one who knew that the Thompson legacy was a house of cards built on a foundation of theft. Annabelle caught Margaret's eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. The older woman's hand trembled as she lifted her glass, her gaze darting toward the podium at the head of the room, where a projector screen had been lowered for Richard's planned presentation on the future of the Thompson estate. The audacity of it was breathtaking. Richard intended to announce the sale of the North Acreage, land that had been in their grandmother's name for 60 years, to James Harrison's firm tonight. He was selling the heart of the estate to fund his own failing ventures, all while pretending it was a move to evolve the family brand. 10 minutes, Richard's voice echoed through the house as he tapped a spoon against a crystal flute. Everyone, please take your seats. We have a momentous announcement to make. The guests began to filter into the dining hall, a sea of silk and wool. Annabelle took her seat at the very end of the table, the furthest point from the head. Richard sat at the throne-like chair that had once belonged to their father, looking every bit the king of a borrowed kingdom. You look like you're attending a funeral, Megan whispered, leaning over from the seat next to her. In a way, Annabelle replied, her fingers grazing the clutch on her lap. The room settled into an expectant hush. The clatter of silverware died down, replaced by the low hum of the projector warming up. Richard stood, his chest puffed out, the light of the chandelier reflecting off his polished forehead. He looked at the room full of witnesses, the lawyers, the investors, the social rivals, and raised his glass. Tonight, Richard began, his voice dropping into a rehearsed baritone gravitas, we celebrate more than just a name. We celebrate the vision of the Thompson family. For years, I have worked to ensure that this estate remains a beacon of success. And tonight, with the support of my partners, we take the final step in securing that future. He gestured toward the screen. But before we get to the business of the evening, I want to take a moment to look back at how far we've come. Because as I always say, you can't know where you're going until you acknowledge who truly owns the path. Annabelle felt the blood rushing in her ears, a rhythmic thrum that matched the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. She looked at the screen, then at the side door where Harold Jennings had just appeared, a leather briefcase gripped firmly in his hand. He looked at Annabelle, his expression unreadable, and checked his watch. Richard clicked a remote in his hand. The first slide appeared, a black and white photo of the estate from the 1950s. My grandfather built this, Richard lied, his voice thick with unearned pride. And I am the one who kept it. Annabelle reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She sent a single text message, *now. Across the room, the projector flickered. The image of the old house didn't change, but a small dialogue box appeared in the corner of the screen, indicating a new source was being overridden. Richard didn't notice yet. He was too busy basking in the admiring gazes of the front row. I've spent a lifetime protecting this heritage, Richard continued, his hand sweeping across the room to encompass the art, the silver, and the very walls. And tonight, I am proud to announce that the Thompson estate will be entering a new era of... The screen went black for a heartbeat. Then, a new image flickered to life. It wasn't a map of the North Acreage. It wasn't a corporate logo. It was a high-resolution scan of a legal document, the gold seal of the state notary gleaming under the projector's bulb. At the top, in bold, unmistakable letters, were the words, Last Will and Testament of Eleanorwhitmore. A confused murmur rippled through the guests. James Harrison leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he read the lines of text. Richard froze, his glass still raised, his mouth hanging open mid-sentence. He turned slowly, his neck craning to look at the screen behind him. What is this? Richard hissed, fumbling with the remote. This isn't the file. Who changed the file? Annabelle stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and drew every eye in the room toward the end of the long table. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the low, mechanical hum of the projector cooling fan. You wanted to talk about who owns the path, Richard, Annabelle said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. I think it's time everyone saw the map. Annabelle Rose Thompson didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt like a physical weight, pressing down on the guests who had, moments ago, been laughing at the antagonist's jokes. She walked slowly toward the front of the room, her modest dress a stark contrast to the shimmering silk Megan Thompson wore. The air in the hall felt charged, humming with the low, mechanical drone of the projector that was currently dismantling a decade of lies. "The file hasn't been changed, Richard," Annabelle said, her voice steady. "It's simply been updated to reflect the truth." Richard Thompson's hand shook as he pointed the remote at the screen, clicking frantically as if he could erase the words through sheer force of will. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, carving a path through his expensive foundation. His face, usually a mask of bronze-tanned arrogance, had turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray, like old parchment left in the rain. His lower lip began a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch, and his eyes, usually sharp and predatory, darted around the room with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. The confident smirk that had defined his career didn't just fade. It collapsed, leaving his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged O that made him look decades older than he was. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a man watching his own execution in real time. "This is a prank," he stammered, his voice cracking. "A glitch. Annabelle, sit down. You're embarrassing yourself." "Is it a prank, Harold?" she asked, turning toward the back of the room. Harold Jennings stood up from his seat near the center aisle. The family's longtime attorney adjusted his spectacles, his expression as grave as a tombstone. "The document on the screen is a certified digital copy of the final codicil signed by Eleanor Whitmore 3 weeks ago. It was filed with the state this morning. I witnessed the signature myself, and the digital encryption is unbreakable." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Aunt Margaret pressed a lace handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and dawning realization. She looked from the screen to the woman standing at the head of the table, her hand trembling. Megan Thompson, who had been sipping a vintage champagne, let her glass slip. It shattered against the marble floor, the golden liquid splashing her designer heels, but she didn't even blink. Her face was twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as she realized the inheritance she'd already spent in her head was vanishing. James Harrison leaned back, crossing his arms, a cold, clinical disgust settling over his features as he looked at the man he had once considered a partner. "You lied," James murmured, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "You told the board the estate was already in your name." "It's mine," Richard roared, though the sound lacked its usual bite. It was the desperate howl of a man drowning. "I've run this company for 10 years. She's a music teacher. She doesn't know a ledger from a lyric sheet. You can't give the path to a girl who plays the piano for toddlers." Annabelle Rose Thompson stepped into the light of the projector, the words of her grandmother's will scrolling across her skin like a second armor. She looked at the guests, the friends who had ignored her, the family who had treated her like an intruder in her own home. "You're right, Richard," she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. "I don't care about your ledgers, but I do care about the deed to this house, and the ownership of the Thompson Group, and the legacy you've spent the last hour claiming as your own." She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a single, heavy brass key. She held it up, letting it catch the light so everyone could see the Whitmore crest engraved on the bow. "Eleanor Whitmore knew exactly who you were," she continued, her gaze locking onto his. "She knew about the hidden accounts. She knew about the piano you stole from me to pay off your first gambling debt. And she knew that the only way to save this family was to cut out the rot." Richard lunged toward the laptop, but Harold Jennings was already there, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who had been standing inconspicuously by the doors. They stepped forward, their presence a silent, immovable wall. "You said earlier that I didn't belong in this room," Annabelle said, her tone almost conversational. "And for once I agree with you. I don't belong in a room filled with your lies." She turned to the room, her eyes sweeping over the silent, shocked witnesses. "The locks on this estate are being changed at midnight," she announced. "I suggest you check your personal belongings before then. Anything bought with estate funds stays with the estate." She looked at her brother one last time. He was slumped against the mahogany table, the very table he'd claimed as his throne, looking small and broken. "I'll see you in court for the embezzlement," she said. Without waiting for a response, without a single glance back at the wreckage of his ego, she turned and walked toward the exit. The heavy oak doors swung open for her, and for the first time in her life, The air outside the Thompson estate felt clean. 10 minutes after the heavy oak doors had latched behind her, the evening air still felt like a shock to Annabelle Rose Thompson's lungs. She stood on the gravel driveway of the estate, the sharp, metallic tang of a coming thunderstorm hanging heavy in the atmosphere. Behind her, the house she had grown up in, the house that had been turned into a monument to her brother's ego, loomed like a silent tomb. Harold Jennings stood beside the idling black town car, his expression unreadable as he checked his watch. The rhythmic asterisk thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers started as a light drizzle began to fall, coating the world in a slick, shimmering gray. "The digital freeze was initiated 3 minutes ago," Harold said, his voice barely rising above the hum of the engine. "By the time he reaches for his phone, the Thompson accounts will be as cold as a stone." A muffled roar echoed from inside the house, followed by the sound of something heavy shattering against wood. Annabelle didn't flinch. She climbed into the back of the car, the scent of expensive, sterile leather wrapping around her like a shroud. She felt the weight of the silver key in her pocket, a small, cold object that now represented everything Richard Thompson had lost. She watched through the tinted window as the front door of the estate flew open. Richard stumbled out onto the portico, his silk tie loosened and his face a mask of frantic, sweating desperation. He was clutching his smartphone as if it were a lifeline, his thumb stabbing at the screen with a violence that made his knuckles white. "Annabelle!" he screamed, the sound raw and ugly in the quiet neighborhood. "You crazy bitch! Turn it back on! You hear me? Turn it back on!" He lunged toward the moving car, but Harold's driver was already pulling away. Annabelle watched Richard in the side mirror. As the realization of his situation finally took hold, Richard's face underwent a terrifying transformation. The arrogant smirk he had worn like armor for decades didn't just fade, it disintegrated. His skin turned a sickly, mottled gray, the color of wet ash. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, became glassy and unfocused, darting around the driveway as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. His lower lip developed a persistent, rhythmic tremor that he couldn't suppress, even as he tried to snarl another insult. He looked less like a titan of industry, and more like a man watching his own execution in slow motion, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that rattled in his chest. He collapsed against the stone pillar of the gate, his hand dropping the phone onto the wet gravel. The screen shattered, a spider web of light reflecting the porch lamps. "He's calling James Harrison," Annabelle noted, watching a second phone, Richard's work line light up in his other hand. "Let him," Harold replied, opening a sleek laptop on his knees. "Mr. Harrison has already been briefed on the embezzlement files. He's currently drafting the press release to distance the board from your brother's personal legal matters." The car turned onto the main road, leaving the estate behind. Annabelle's phone buzzed in her lap. It was a text from Megan Thompson. "You've ruined everything. Mom is hysterical. The movers are at the door and they're taking the piano. How could you do this to your own family? You're a monster." Annabelle deleted the message without replying. The monster was the one who had spent years gaslighting a music teacher while living off a dead woman's secrets. She leaned back, feeling the vibration of the car beneath her. "The liquidation of the secondary assets begins at dawn," Harold continued, his fingers dancing across the keys. "The penthouse in the city, the yacht in the harbor, even the vehicles registered to the holding company. By noon tomorrow, Richard won't own the shoes on his feet." "And Diane?" Annabelle asked, her voice steady. "Your mother has been served with the notice of eviction for the guest house. Aunt Margaret has offered her a room in the cottage, provided she agrees to the audit of the jewelry she borrowed from Alina Whitmore's vault." Annabelle closed her eyes, imagining the scene. She could almost smell the cloying, floral perfume her mother used to mask the scent of her expensive gin. She could see the outrage on Megan's face as the designer handbags were tagged and bagged by the recovery agents. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the visibility of the fall. The Thompson name, which Richard had polished until it blinded everyone, was being stripped of its gilding in real time. The car pulled up to a stoplight, and Annabelle noticed a familiar figure standing on the corner, huddled under an umbrella. It was James Harrison. He was staring at his own phone, his face set in a grim line of professional disgust. He looked up as the town car paused, catching Annabelle's gaze through the glass. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply gave a sharp, single nod of acknowledgement, a silent validation that the king was dead and the rightful heir had taken the throne. "He knows," Annabelle whispered. "Everyone knows now," Harold said. "The news of the freeze has hit the private equity circles. Richard's reputation is currently worth less than the gravel he's standing on." Annabelle pulled a small, velvet-lined box from her bag. Inside sat the Whitmore signet ring, the one Richard had claimed was lost years ago. She slid it onto her finger. It was heavy, the gold cool against her skin. "He told me once that I didn't belong in his world," she said, looking at the ring. "He was right. I don't belong in a world built on theft and shadows." She looked out the window as the car accelerated toward the city lights. Behind them, the estate was fading into the rain, a dark silhouette of a legacy that had finally been reclaimed. Richard was likely still there, screaming at a broken phone, realizing too late that the sister he had mocked was the one who held the deed to his life. "Where to, Miss Thompson?" the driver asked. Annabelle looked at the shimmering skyline, her reflection in the glass finally looking like the woman her grandmother had raised her to be. "To the office," she said, her voice cold and final. "I believe there's a board meeting in the morning, and I wouldn't want to keep them waiting for their new chair." She felt a strange, quiet sense of peace. The rage that had fueled her for months hadn't vanished. It had simply crystallized into a sharp, unbreakable diamond. Richard had spent his life building a house of cards, and she had finally opened the window. The storm broke then, a flash of lightning illuminating the interior of the car for a split second. In that light, Annabelle Rose Thompson didn't look like a victim. She looked like a reckoning. 6 months had passed since the night the Thompson empire collapsed into a heap of fraudulent deeds and broken promises. The scandal had been a feast for the local tabloids, but for Annabelle Rose Thompson, the ensuing half-year had been a lesson in the quiet, heavy weight of victory. She stood now on the terrace of the Whitmore estate, the scent of rain-dampened stone and blooming jasmine rising from the gardens below. The sprawling property, once a distant dream she'd only heard of in her grandmother's hushed stories, was now her reality. She wore a simple charcoal silk dress, a stark contrast to the modest, threadbare cardigans she had favored as a music teacher, yet she still felt like a ghost haunting someone else's grandeur. Harold Jennings stepped onto the terrace, his footsteps muffled by the thick outdoor rug. He held a leather-bound folder and a cup of espresso that had long since gone cold. He looked older than he had during the board meeting, the lines around his eyes deepened by months of untangling the legal knots Richard Thompson had tied around the family's throat. "The final liquidation of his personal assets is complete," he said, his voice carrying the dry satisfaction of a man who enjoyed seeing the scales of justice balance. "The penthouse, the fleet of cars, even the offshore accounts he tried to hide in his mother's name. It's all been reclaimed. After the creditors were paid, there was barely enough left to cover his own legal fees." Annabelle didn't turn around. She watched a hawk circle the distant tree line. "And where is he now, Harold?" "A basement apartment in the East District," the lawyer replied, unable to hide a small, sharp smile. "It's a far cry from the glass towers he used to look down from. I'm told he's currently attempting to sell his remaining designer watches to pay for his heating bill. He reached out to my office again this morning, demanding a consultation fee for the transition of the Foundation's records." Annabelle felt a familiar spark of heat in her chest, a rage spike she thought she'd buried. Even now, stripped of his borrowed finery and reduced to a damp cellar, he had the audacity to demand payment for his own failures. He was a man who had never learned that the world didn't owe him a seat at the table he hadn't built. "Ignore him," she said, her voice like a chilling breeze. "He spent his life charging others for his presence. Let him learn what it's like to be invisible." She turned and walked back into the house, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble, a status sound she had once envied and now found hollow. She made her way toward the north wing, where the air grew cooler and the house grew silent. This was the hospice suite, a room that smelled of sterile lavender and the metallic tang of medicine. Eleanor Whitmore lay in the center of the massive bed, her frame so frail she seemed to be disappearing into the white linens. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the oxygen concentrator was the only pulse in the room. The architect of this entire reckoning was finally resting, her work finished. Annabelle sat by the bed and took her grandmother's hand. It felt like parchment stretched over bird bones. For a moment the silence was absolute, a wait-for-it moment that stretched until the older woman's eyes fluttered open. There was no confusion in that gaze, only a sharp, crystalline clarity. "Did you do it?" Eleanor whispered, the sound like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "Everything is back where it belongs," she replied softly. "The house, the foundation, the name." "He has nothing left, Grandma." Eleanor's lips twitched into a ghost of a smile. "Good, the music! Don't let it stop." That was the last thing she said. An hour later, the mechanical hiss stopped and the architect was gone. In the days following the funeral, the cost of the war became painfully clear. Annabelle sat in the grand music room, the keys of the Steinway reflecting the gray light of a drizzly afternoon. Her phone buzzed on the mahogany lid. It was a message from Megan Thompson, a frantic string of texts begging for a loan. Her sister had been forced into a retail job at a department store where she used to spend thousands. The public shaming of her fall from grace had been swift and merciless. Diane, their mother, hadn't called once. The enabler had retreated into a shell of bitter silence, unable to face a daughter she could no longer control. The victory was total, yet the house felt cavernous. Annabelle had the inheritance, the power, and the justice she had craved, but the family she had once hoped to save was a charred ruin of its own making. She realized then that the real inheritance wasn't the gold or the stone. It was the terrifying freedom of being the only one left standing. She opened the lid of the piano and played a single, low chord that vibrated through the floorboards. The sound was lonely, perfect, and final. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small brass key to the estate's main gates. She didn't need it anymore. The gates were closed, the debt was paid, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have to look over her shoulder to see who was coming to take what was hers. As the final notes faded into the vast, empty halls, Annabelle Rose Thompson closed her eyes, finally at peace with the woman she had become to survive.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.